Thank you. So if we can move now to so we are, what we say is that we are the global language of business. We are a global standard organization, neutral and not for profit, user driven and governed, both global and local, and inclusive. And our base is the collaboration between the different trading partners. Next, please. Do we have the- So some numbers about GS1. Okay. So we have 112 local GS1 organizations in all these countries, although we serve to more than 150 countries. 1.5 million companies are using the GS1 standard. More than 100 million products carry also our standard. And we are in touch with people because there are 6 billion beep in supermarkets when the products are scanned. So everybody knows us for retail, but we are working in some other sectors. I would especially mention that we are working very, very hard in healthcare across all the world, and just bringing our standards to help to save a life, because wrong identification is a major issue in healthcare. Now, when we say that we are user-driven and user-governed, we have a global board and we have top business executives from different sectors and regions across the world. Here you can see the companies from all the areas. We have traditional retailers, we have brand owners, we have new retailers, Amazon, eBay, companies from China, and they are all together, and we all work together just to move the global standard in logistics and also in the demand side today. We also had a lot of work with global regulators, standard bodies, and NGOs, especially on global regulators. What we are helping is that regulators can talk to each other in our forums and trying to align the regulations, because different regulations bring a lot of inefficiencies to companies across the world. So there are two types of things that we do. On one side, we have the global standard, but we also develop some services. Our standards are in three areas: identification of products, the capture and the carry of the data, and then the sharing of information between different trading partners. On identification, we have identification, for example, for pallets, identification for the cases, and identification for the individual units. Now, all this identification is completely global and very helpful for the companies, you can imagine. The other thing that we have is a set of identifiers for physical locations, manufacturing plant, distribution centers, retail stores. So this is used by all our users in all the trading relations. Then we have not only the identification, but the carriers. I mean, you can see here several examples of different type of barcodes. We also have bidimensional barcodes like QR code or data matrix. And one of the areas that we created was the carriers for radio, RFID, radio frequency identification, what we call electronic product code, that is extending across all retail really, really fast. EDI, just allowing companies sharing information, thanks to the standardization of all the transactions, orders, invoices, just using the attributes defined in our global data dictionary. Then talking about services, there are several services that are very strong at GS1. One is what we call global data synchronization. And this is a service that allows companies, trading partners, exchange master data in a complete automatic way. And this is a major improvement because the number of errors in the communication between companies was really, really terrible. We have more than 40,000 companies across all the world just exchanging master data when using this system. Also very important is our traceability standard. This is something that we have done for quite a number of years, and they are becoming every day more important just to do the full track of products from the, what we say, from the farm to the fork. And we have just developed a new generation of traceability standards, and now we are studying how to incorporate blockchain in the next generation of our traceability standards. As I said before, probably one of the areas in which we have had the biggest growth is in the area of healthcare. GS1 in retail and in consumer goods has been operating for 40 years. And in healthcare, just in the last 10 years, but we have managed to build in 10 years all what we did for retail in 40 years. So this is a really, really high. And the last thing that I want to mention is that we are now extending all our standards from the physical world to the digital world. So allowing consumers that by reading a barcode, they get complete information, transparent information, trusted information about the product. This is something that is not available in the market. Most of the sources of data come from crowdsourcing, but our system that is right now starting to get developed is going to provide information directly from the brand owner, which is a unique proposition right now. So this is the summary of what we do. And the last piece is we think we have been very, very close with the glide for quite a number of years, practically from the beginning. And we completely understood that the LEI will become the identifier for all legal entities across the world. And we think that it is quite important that the flow of goods in which we are operating also runs in parallel with the flow of monies. And we thought that having an alliance with the GLIFE is strategic for us and for all our companies because they will be users of the LAI. And this is why we enter into conversations, and there are already some of our organizations that are become members. And now what we are going to create is a global LOU. So the GLIFE developed the standard, and we use our network in these 112 countries to talk with the regulators to explain what the LAI does, what this brings to their economies, and helping them to train to use the LAI. And we expect that we will have a very, very strong success and expansion of the LAI system. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miguel. So finally, but not least, is Hudson Hollister. Hudson, if you can talk to us a little bit about all of your efforts in the transparency world. Are you looking for a clicker? Terrific.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm excited to be here. I represent the Data Coalition. We are a trade association of 43 companies based here in Washington. Together, our 43 different companies represent over 200,000 Americans employed and $1.5 trillion in market capital, in market value among those that are public companies. But don't let me fool you, the vast bulk of that is Fujitsu. We are a small trade association. Our mission, so far as I know, we are the only trade association in the world focused on persuading government to adopt data standards. That is our mission. We began 5 years ago, and we work to adopt mandates. We work to persuade politicians that data standards matter. And if you need proof of that, I think, unfortunately, this room is proof. when Congressman Schweikert gave his keynote address at 2 p.m., this room was reasonably full. There are 702 chairs in this audience. I counted them. We right now have 16 people in the audience. Of that, 9 people in the audience are staff members serving speakers who are up on this dais. Now, I think this exercise is still valuable because it's being recorded and because it's good to build connections among just our organizations, but I'm not under any illusions. We're making connections among each other. We are not, at this point, we are not evangelizing. Our coalition was founded because of that thesis, because unless politicians get involved, we're not going to be able to achieve what Robin talked about. We're not going to be able to achieve that critical mass of LEI adoption. We are not going to be able to have what Stefan talked about. We are not going to have consistent adoption of a non-proprietary identifier. Unless we go to the politicians, as we saw happening in the keynote address that happened in this room a few hours ago, unless we go to the politicians, none of this progress is going to happen. Regulators are not going to act unless they're pushed. And so that's our coalition's job, and that's what we've been working on for the last 5 years. I was going to map out, when I prepared earlier today, I was going to map out what universal LEI adoption might look like, but I think I'm going to pass over that for now because it's more important to talk about how we are trying to persuade politicians to embrace standards. The Data Coalition has been working since its founding to persuade Congress to impose these mandates on agencies that otherwise are not going to act. I'm going to tick through them real fast. First, the Data Act of 2014 was our first victory. Congress enacted it in order to require the U.S. federal government to adopt standardized fields and formats for spending. The Data Act of 2014 took all the information that agencies must report on their finances, their account balances, their grants, their contracts, their payments, and mandated the adoption of a common data structure across all of that mess. In 1802, President Thomas Jefferson wrote to his Treasury Secretary complaining that the U.S. government spending had become too complicated. He said that Congress was, by this point, unable to understand federal spending. He asked his Treasury Secretary if the spending could be put into, quote, one consolidated mass so that it could be understood. That need that Jefferson first articulated in 1802 still exists, and the Data Act addresses it by using standards to put all the information about spending into one consolidated mass. The Data Act was enacted in 2014, but it's being implemented now, and every federal agency began reporting its spending using those common standards last May. We now have that one consolidated mass. Proposed in Congress right now, the Financial Transparency Act. The bill number is H.R. 1530. We have 30 co-sponsors. The Financial Transparency Act will solve our problems in financial services. The Financial Transparency Act will, let's forget trying to persuade the regulators, it will directly force them to adopt the LEI for all of the information that's reported under the securities laws, the commodities laws, the Banking Act, and Dodd-Frank. Just simply mandate it. We have Republicans co-sponsoring, we have Democrats co-sponsoring. Our co-sponsors include Congressman Schweikert, who was the keynote here a few hours ago. And our goal right now is to persuade the House Financial Services to take the bill up. We need to build our support further beyond the 30 members of Congress currently supporting in order to persuade the committee to do that, because the bill was proposed by a member who's not on the committee. Here's a diagram showing what the Financial Transparency Act will do. All of the information reported by the U.S. financial services industry and by public companies is to be standardized using consistent fields and formats. And as I mentioned, there's a direct mandate in that bill for the FTA, or I'm sorry, a direct mandate in that bill for the legal entity identifier. Finally, if you've been paying attention to what Congress is doing right now, today, as I speak, the Open Government Data Act is on the Senate floor. The Open Government Data Act is a broad mandate for every federal agency to adopt open data for everything it does, for every federal agency to adopt non-proprietary fields and formats for all the information that it collects and generates and manages. Right now, the Open Government Data Act is in Senator John McCain's manager's amendment for the National Defense Appropriations Act, which is expected to pass. We feel confident, based on what's happening in the Senate right now, that the Open Government Data Act will become law. It doesn't have a direct mandate for the LAI. However, you better believe that as we go to agencies, once the Open Government Data Act is law, as we go to agencies trying to persuade them to adopt open standards like the LAI, we're going to be citing that. We're going to be pointing out that the general policy of the US government is in favor of open standards. That's what's happening right now. The Data Act being implemented, the Financial Transparency Act on the House's agenda, and the Open Government Data Act on the Senate floor right now as I speak. Here's what we're working on in the future. Within the next 2 months, some of our allies in Congress will be introducing a bill to mandate standards for grant reporting. Federal grantees, including state governments, local governments, tribal governments, and nonprofits, face a massive compliance burden when it comes to reporting on their receipt of over $1 trillion of federal funds every year. Grantees have to fill out, manually fill out PDF forms for that work. To automate that reporting, our allies in Congress will be proposing a reform that requires a consistent set of data standards for all of those forms. Those data standards will be required to be non-proprietary. The only answer in grant reporting, as in so many other places, is the LEI. Finally, in the farther future is standard business reporting. As adopted in Australia, that's our diagram here, standard business reporting creates a single data structure for all the information that flows from regulated companies to regulatory agencies. We will be discussing this in our annual conference, Data Transparency 2017, where we'll have the Deputy Minister of Innovation for Australia traveling from Canberra to address our audience. Standard business reporting is already saving $1 billion a year in compliance costs for Australian companies. It could save, just by simple math, $15 billion a year at the outset for US companies. We hope to see it enacted as a reform in the US government. We don't have a bill yet. That's coming in the future. When you add all these things together, here's the vision. The US government uses a mishmash of identifiers for these entities today. These are just the areas that we are working on. This is not a map of all the places where the US federal and state governments identify entities. However, if we have our druthers in all these places, we will have a common and a non-proprietary identification code for companies. In order to do these things, we need to keep building our campaign. We need to grow our trade association larger. We need to persuade the politicians, not the regulators. We need to persuade the politicians that they should act. Alongside the Data Coalition, which I've described, our trade association, I also am the head of the Data Foundation. I want very much to not be the head of two organizations. We'll be spinning off the Data Foundation as quickly as we can, but for now we have one staff that runs both organizations. Today, this morning, the Data Foundation released our paper, our research project, Who is Who and What is What? It is the first full-length research paper on the need for consistent entity identification that exists independently of the financial industry. We tried to explain what the LEI is and why it matters to an audience that doesn't have to know about financial services in an effort to help the LEI grow beyond just the financial services field. We hope that you will continue to connect with us. Here's all the contact information. I thank you all for your time. I look forward to working to persuade the politicians. Thank you.
Thank you, Hudson. Well, Hudson, thank you very much for your patience in speaking last. I think what I'd like to do is really, out of respect for the panelists and those of you who have chosen to spend time, is just end with one final question, which really keys off of what Hudson talked about here, which is if we could just go down the line and if the panelists would just provide their observations on what are going to be the critical elements to get this thing adopted in a way that serves the various needs that we've all discussed today. Maybe with you?
I can try, yeah. We heard a lot about the benefits today, and they're real. The problem is nobody wants to be the first one. it's a typical problem of a public good that the first is the one to pay and the others will have the benefit from it. So if one bank would mandate the LEI for all its clients, the clients would say thank you, take the LEI and go to another bank and onboard there. And the banks never talk about that really, but I think that's an issue, right? So we need to have a concerted action of the private sector and the public sector to overcome this issue, to make a broad public good available that goes over the tipping point where it becomes an automatic standard where everybody wants to have one, otherwise you can't do business anymore with each other. So my question is always, do you have an LEI, and if not, why? And we need to answer that.
I think in the GS1 world, what we have learned is that the GS1 standards are deployed quickly when there is a mandate from retailers or regulators. This is, I shouldn't say this, but this is the reality. I think that if there are mandates from regulators across the countries, the deployment will be very, very fast.
Yeah, hear, hear. I mean, I think you've heard me say that already. And, it is unfortunate that we need a bit of a stick, not just a carrot in this particular case, but I do believe that we need the support of the regulatory community to get this done. It'll drag out and happen over time, but if we really want to get it done and get it done soon, we just need a few more big regulatory bodies to say, you must have an LEI to do business in these markets.
I think that being able to have a standard identifier both for the entity as well as for the individual persons would definitely help all of us because I think that there is an opportunity for us to be able to track that, right? We always follow the money when it comes to financial crimes, and if we can use that identifier to be able to track the path, I think that would be a huge advantage for all of us, and then it would be a lot easier for us to share information as well, right, when it comes to sharing our knowledge with both the government side and even with each other in the banking sector.
I know I sound impatient, but I'm actually not. We recognize that this takes time. When the Data Act was first conceived in Congress, that was in the middle of 2010, we finally got the full application of non-proprietary data standards for federal spending in May 2017. That's 7 years. It takes time to build these mandates. There are a couple of steps without which it'll never happen. And as I pointed out, persuading the politicians is the step without which this will never happen. But I firmly believe that it will, and that we will succeed. Maybe I'm a little Marxist in that way. You think it's inevitable, but you still have to work toward it. Well, they were wrong, but here in the standards world, we're right, and we'll keep working on it until it happens.
Well, thank you all very much for your time. Thank you for you and the audience who stayed with us. I will say that in hopes that tomorrow you're able to come back or read about the Secretary's remarks, that we do get a lift to this program by the Secretary. You never know. But the goal will be that we'll at least see some support out of our new Treasury. We have, I think, gone 6 or 7 years since the G20 issued its first mandate, and things went along just fine, but maybe there's a renewed opportunity for embrace of this standard and pushing this thing forward. So thank you all for your time, and thank you very much, panelists, for all your work. All right, bye-bye.